Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of Fan Talk, your favorite podcast by your favorite fan. That is, of course, me, Kyle Brenchley, in the house on this sunny Wednesday. The cold weather has officially gone, and I think summertime is here. I don't want to jinx it, though. Rogue One poster, always with me, never leaves my side. Great Star Wars movie. We have a lot to talk about this week, and we're going to be talking about the NBA specifically. The NBA draft lottery obviously happened a little while ago. We'll be talking about some crazy things that happened and reactions from different fan bases based on the results. But first, Fan Talk is a podcast that you can find on YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Podcasts, and now Apple Podcast as well. Pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts, I'm there. Go look me up. Give me a follow, give me a like, tell your friends, tell your boyfriend, tell your girlfriend, tell your dog. That's right. Even dogs listen to Fan Talk. All right, but before we get into the meat of the meal, let's do the Fan Talk Fast Talk. All right, Caitlin Clark made her WNBA debut last night for the Indiana Fever. She scored 20 points, but had 10 turnovers. A little bit of a slow start, a little bit of a struggle. She eventually did, put in the 20 points, but 10 turnovers. It's just the jitters. But Caitlin Clark looks to bounce back. She simply said, learn from my mistakes and move on. And the Indiana Fever ended up dropping that game 94-71. They're hoping for brighter days with Caitlin Clark at the helm. Nikola Jokic wins the NBA MVP. That's his third MVP title in the last 4 years. Some really argue that he should have won it last year, which would have meant 4 years in a row. Regardless, 3 out of 4 years. Quite the feat for Nikola Jokic. He then proceeds to go off in Game 5, and the Denver Nuggets defeat the Minnesota Timberwolves and take a 3-2 series lead. 88% of the time, the team that wins Game 5 goes on to win the series. Netflix, the newest streaming service to get their hand in the NFL cookie jar. They will broadcast 2 NFL games on Christmas Day this year. They will have the Baltimore Ravens and the Houston Texans, as well as the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Kansas City Chiefs. So kind of interesting how Netflix is jumping in. Obviously, Peacock had Peacock exclusives last year. Amazon has their hand in, and now Netflix adds their name to the list of streaming services broadcasting NFL games. All right, that was your Fan Talk Fast Talk. 3 stories, real fast. Okay, in this episode, we are going to be talking NBA. We're going to be talking about the NBA draft. Now, if you remember last episode, I talked about the NHL draft. And what they do with that, they do a lottery system. So essentially, and it's the same thing in the NBA. All the teams that do not make the playoffs, all 16 teams, I believe, 16 teams in both leagues, they get put in essentially a drawing. Now, the worst teams with the worst records have the highest chance. They have higher chances of getting the 1 seed. So in the NHL, you saw that the San Jose Sharks, they had the worst record in the NHL. They ended up getting the number 1 pick because they had higher odds. That way, it's fair, but it's also gives these crappier teams a chance. In the NFL, they just do it straight up. The worst team with the worst record gets the number 1 pick and so forth. NBA, NHL, it's a little different, but still, if you're the worst of the league, there's a very good chance you get the number 1 pick. You look at the Detroit Pistons, a team who has not been good for years and who has a bunch of young players because they always get a top 3, if not the overall number 1 pick every single year. This year, it was different. It was different in Chicago in the NBA draft. The Atlanta Hawks. Any Atlanta Hawks fans out there? I don't think so. I wouldn't say I'm a fan. I love Trae Young. There's actually a Trae Young jersey at Plato's Closet as we speak. My closest Plato's Closet for $40. And I was tempted to get it, but I'll tell you why I didn't in just a second. The Atlanta Hawks only had a 3% chance. And if you remember, they made the NBA play-in. So they were in the play-in to make the playoffs. So because they lost, they got the number 1 pick. If they would have won, they would have made the playoffs and not even been in this position. So they get the number one pick having only a 3% chance, which kind of blows your mind because everyone going in was thinking, okay, Pistons or Wizards, are going to get, the number one pick because they were abysmal this year. Maybe the Spurs if they're lucky. And the Wizards did get the second pick. Pistons dropped to 5. Spurs got 4. And so you're just thinking, okay, so usually it works out that way. Because as I stated earlier, teams with worse records, they have better odds. So the Wizards, they had better odds. And they landed at 2, pretty much where they were projected to be. But the Hawks went against the narrative. Chance was on their side, and they got the number one pick. So, more on that in just a second. Let's talk about the Utah Jazz real quick. Obviously, from Utah, grew up a Jazz fan, still am a Jazz fan, for sure. You can't be from Utah and not like the Jazz. I get it if you move from a different state, but if you're born and raised here in Utah, you're from Utah, you're a Jazz fan. The Jazz have been in Utah since the 70s. Everybody loves them. It's a good time. The last couple years have been less than ideal. They have been pretty bad, actually, in terms of managing the season, in the direction the team's trying to go. The rebuild's not really going that well. Now, I've heard a couple different things, and I don't think the Jazz exactly know what they're doing, and if they do, then they're not doing it very well. When it comes down to it, there are 2 types of teams in the NBA. There really is. I'm boiling it down so basic. There's 2 types of teams in the NBA. There are teams that are trying to win, and they're trying to win now, and then there's teams that are rebuilding to win in, maybe 5-6 years. The Jazz, a couple years ago, 3 years ago, when they had Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, Mike Conley, Joe Ingles, Bojan Bogdanovic, they were trying to win now. They kind of had that core group for like five or so seasons. They'd been in the playoffs 6 seasons in a row, and one season they even got the number 1 seed, best record in the NBA, number 1 seed. So they are really trying to win now, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of patience to be had in professional sports. Literally the phrase win now, they expect you to win now. And the Jazz just didn't do that in the playoffs. Like I said, they had the number 1 seed, but they lost in the conference semis. The next year they lost in the first round. And they just couldn't get to the Western Conference Finals. Not even one appearance with that core group. And obviously no championships. And so, as it often happens, teams blow it up. They say, okay, well, it didn't work with these guys. Let's trade everyone away. Let's rebuild and start fresh. So they traded Rudy Gobert, got so much for it. They traded Mitchell, got so much for it. All the other guys, they blew up the team. Jordan Clarkson is the only remaining player from those years, frankly. He's the last man standing, and he might be on the way out too. But that's for another day. So the Jazz, they don't win. They blow it up. They rebuild. And the first year of the rebuild, they actually play pretty well for the first half of the season. They kind of go on a little hot streak. They start out the season really good. And at that point, you're like, okay, well, we're doing pretty good. Do we tank? Because, Victor Wembanyama, the 7'4" Frenchman, he's going to be in the draft, likely the number 1 pick. So do we tank for him? But we're playing pretty good right now. Do we try to make a push for the playoffs? Excuse me, they're kind of caught in between this dilemma. Do we try to win or do we tank? And I don't think they really decided. I don't think they really decided one way or the other because they were going one direction and then they switched. And for it to really work, you got to really commit to one discipline or another. Obviously, it didn't quite work out. They missed the playoffs. Didn't get a great draft pick. Keontae George, Sensabaugh, and Taylor Hendricks still a lot to prove there. A lot of promise, but still a lot to prove there. So then this year, it was the same kind of deal. They're like, okay, we're going to try to tank to see if we can get a good pick. But then they play pretty well in the first half of the season. But then second half, of course, injuries happen. So they're just playing all the young guys. And they're like, okay, we're going to commit to the tanking idea. And so they were projected to get the 8th overall pick based on odds. But they had a chance, obviously, to get the number 1 overall pick. When the draft lottery came out, they ended up getting the 10th overall pick. And I don't know if they were really screwed by the system If anything else, they screwed themselves, and here's why. With the lottery system, yes, if you're the worst team in the league, you have better odds. But I would say this, only if you're the bottom 3 teams. So this year it was Detroit, it was Washington, and then I think it was the Spurs were the third worst team. It was either Spurs or Trailblazers, one of those teams. Unless you're like really, really bad, and these teams were really, really bad. Pistons won what, 17 games, if that? If you're only winning games in the teens and you're really, really bad, then yeah, commit to the tank. But anything other than that, and your odds get kind of lower. Like really, what's the difference between pick number 5 and pick number 8? You know what I mean? Like, sure, I would argue it depends on the draft, but probably the top 3 players in the draft are the most sought after. And obviously, it depends on the draft. The Jazz picked Enes Kanter at 3 once, and who knows where that guy is? That guy was terrible. And so here's my point. Here's my point. Coming back to it, unless you're like really, really bad, and in which case the Jazz, both seasons of the rebuild, they didn't. At the beginning, they started pretty good. Build on that momentum. Don't try to tank mid-season and go back, because then you're going to be like 10, 11, 12. Try to win. Here's my argue. Here's my beef with tanking. And I talked about this in the NFL. There's an NFL video with my beef in tanking. Go look it up. Go check it out. Try to win. Always. Always try to win. And if you lose, then you lose. Look at the Atlanta Hawks. I mean, they had Trae Young, who was injured for a good portion of the season with a bad finger. So, I mean, that actually kind of helped them out in the end, and they ended up missing the playoffs. But there was still a chance that they got the number 1 pick. And in my personal opinion, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it to try to make the playoffs. You get, this is almost like maybe not a perfect, but a very good opportunity, a very good spot to be in. You make the play-in. I'm so excited, I'm just coughing myself out of here. You make the play-in and you give yourself a shot of making the NBA playoffs. And it's hard because if you get the 9 and 10 seed, you have to win 2 games. So you make the NBA play-in. You try to win, you make the NBA play-in. If you win and get into the playoffs, great. You're in the playoffs. If you lose, then you're in the Atlanta Hawks position, and you have a chance of winning the draft lottery and getting the number 1 overall pick, like the Atlanta Hawks did. Okay, so real quick, here was the official draft order. The Atlanta Hawks were first, then the Washington Wizards, Rockets 3, San Antonio Spurs 4, Detroit Pistons 5, and then, of course, Jazz dropped to 10. So, let's talk now, moving forward, what do the Atlanta Hawks do now that they have the number 1 overall pick? Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, that's kind of been a mess. And I know most of you guys aren't Atlanta Hawks fans, but here's a little summary of the last couple of years. They've made the playoffs, pretty much every year with Trae Young at the helm of the team. Trae Young's obviously their superstar. He's their best player. They have a bunch of role players that have been there. They shuffle them in and out. It's been a lot of the same guys, some new guys. And I don't know, similar situation, maybe not quite the same as the Jazz, but a similar situation as other teams in the NBA where it's like they keep going to the playoffs, but they're not winning. So they're like, okay, let's bring in another star. So they bring in DeJounte Murray. And DeJounte Murray's a baller. But he frankly plays better when he's the guy. And in Atlanta, Trae Young was the guy. And DeJounte Murray wasn't the guy, and he just doesn't play as well when he's not the guy. He was definitely the guy in San Antonio when he was there. And so this begs the question. The Atlanta Hawks have the number 1 overall pick. They have all these role players that have been there forever. They have 2 stars in Trae Young and DeJounte Murray that don't particularly play well together. So what do? Do you trade Trae Young, who has a pretty hefty contract, might I say, or do you trade DeJounte Murray? Or do you trade both? Now this is where it connects to the Utah Jazz, because in the beginnings, a lot of the talks were like, okay, they don't get along together, so one goes, and then we do a semi rebuild, not a full rebuild, but we send one away and bring in some more talent. I was always thinking that I'd prefer to keep Donovan Mitchell and maybe send Rudy Gobert somewhere, but also I knew Donovan Mitchell, we could get more for Donovan Mitchell. Same kind of thing here in Atlanta. If I'm a Hawks fan, I think I'd prefer to keep Trae Young, honestly, and then trade DeJounte Murray. But you can get more for Trae Young. And I actually think that it's more likely, if anything, this is what I think. If they are going to make any trades, these are the two options. They're either going to trade both of the players or they're going to trade Trae Young. They're not just going to trade DeJounte Murray, in my opinion. That's just what I think. But, what do you think they should do? It's a tough situation because do you keep both of them and then draft this new guy? I mean, it's not very likely. It's not very feasible. You can tell that Trae and DeJounte do not play well together, so one has to go. And it'll be very interesting moving forward what the Atlanta Hawks will decide to do. I almost feel like they might move on from Trae Young because, face it, he's been there for, let's see, 6 seasons? I think six seasons. And they've been to the playoffs. They went to the Eastern Conference Finals, that crazy run in 2021. But this team's not going to win as it stands. So you keep some of your role players, you get new ones. Those are interchangeable. You trade Trae Young, you get a haul. You keep DeJounte Murray, though. Don't make the same mistake that the Jazz did. Keep one of the stars. Keep DeJounte Murray, draft the first overall pick. Bring in a bunch of picks and players for Trae Young, and you have yourself a future there in Atlanta. See, that's why I didn't buy the jersey at Plato's Closet. $40. I mean, definitely a better deal than finding it on any website or Amazon or anything like that. But also, he might not be in a Hawks uniform next season. So let me know what you guys think about tanking, particularly in the NBA with the lottery system. What do you think the Atlanta Hawks should do about Trae Young and DeJounte Murray? And the Jazz? Do they have a direction? Who knows? Let me know what you guys think down below. I'm always open to suggestions, comments, engagement. Please hit me up on social media as well. And I will thank you very much for joining me for another edition of Fan Talk. Again, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Podcasts. Pretty much, I'm everywhere. Go look me up. Hope you guys have a wonderful Wednesday. Enjoy what you do, because at the end of the day, life is short, it's precious, and it's a lot better with a smile on your face. So, thanks again, guys, for joining. I'll see you guys next week for another edition of Fan Talk.